stern sons of the earth. One morning, not long after the sea-roving Norse colonized the Faroe Islands in the northernmost reaches of the Atlantic, a settler grasped his peat knife and headed for a bog to cut fuel for the winter. Mists coiled up from the fjords and inlets that indented the coastline, and the thin mantle of grass and moss that cloaked the pitched flanks of the island squelched under his feet. High, rain-slicked cliffs of black basalt loomed before him, and he remembered the tales of dwarves, the tales told of a second race populating these lonely islands, a race that seldom was seen. Its members revealed themselves in wisps of smoke curling from the rock falls where they had hidden their tiny forges, in piles of ash that appeared at the bases of crags, the sweeping of minute smithies, and in frantic footsteps that sometimes could be heard through the mist as a dwarf sought to conceal himself from a human. But in all his autumn forays to cut peat, the islander had noticed nothing. This time, however, was different. The path wound through a litter of boulders and then skirted the base of a cleft that he did not remember yawned on the face of the rock, and he saw an orange glow flickering on the fractured stone. Smoke billowed from the top of the cleft, and clattering, hissing noises like those of a smithy issued from the opening. The man inched along the base of the cliff to the mouth of the cavern, hardly breathing. He risked a look and then stared, transfixed. There, deep in the rock, was the source of the glow, a well-stoked forge that sent a whirlwind of flame twisting toward the cathedral-like ceiling of the cleft, and silhouetted against the blaze were three tiny figures, no higher than a man's waist, but casting shadows that reared dark and menacing on the wall behind them. Only with difficulty could the peat cutter pick out the dwarf smiths from among the stones of their rock-built forge. Their skins and aprons were the same sooty gray of the stone, and their bodies were as squat and rounded as heaped boulders. Their features were as coarse and craggy as living rock. But gradually, peering through the shadows and firelight, he distinguished their separate activities. One plied the bellows, lofting a cloud of sparks with every stroke. Another used tongs to hold a glowing scrap of iron steady on the ringing anvil, now and then stabbing the metal into the fire to reheat it. The third, his corded arms glistening, wielded the hammer. The pace of their work was superhuman. The dwarves completed piece after piece with a few hammer blows, plunging into a vat of water to quench and toughen it, releasing clouds of steam and an evil sizzle. And beside them grew a pile of objects that to the poor peat cutter's eyes was as fine as any Viking hoard. There were plowshares and scythes, stoutly wrought. There were daggers as keen and liquidly gleaming as the best Danish steel. There were smooth, rounded kettles and cauldrons, and even a few finely fashioned trinkets of silver filigree. The dwarves' power over lifeless metal seemed magical, and the man forgot himself in wonderment. Carelessly, he let his peat knife slip to the ground. At the sound, the dwarves dropped their work. The cave fell silent, and the flames died down. They turned their fleshy faces toward the opening of the cavern, their cave dwellers' eyes pained and blinking in the light. Then one of the dwarves bent to sort through the pile of smithcraft. He selected a knife as long as the man's forearm and glinting in the glow of the embers. The man drew back in fear until he saw that the dwarf held the knife by the blade. Bandy-legged and hunchbacked, the dwarf scuttled quick as a spider across the rubbled cavern floor. With a glance that mingled shyness and a hint of warning, he thrust the knife into the man's grasp. The islander marveled at the blade, so bright and capable next to the stained and pitted iron of his own peat knife, a product of the village smithy. When he turned to gaze again at the stunted artisans, his eyes met featureless stone. The dwarves were closed in the rock once again. That was one man's encounter with the dwarves. In all the autumns that followed, the cliff never opened to reveal its denizens again. But he cherished the blade and passed it on to his children, for it never rusted or dulled, and it was as rare a souvenir of a hidden race as he could have hoped for. Those were days when the dwarves dwelled throughout northern Europe, wherever men and women lived close to the land, inhabiting rocks, caves, mounds, and even barns. They passed their lives in ways as earthy and arduous as their peasant neighbors. They were an elfin country folk, and their powers were those of the supernatural peasantry. They were uncannily adept at crafts, preternaturally wise in matters of the seasons and the soil. Their names varied from land to land and region to region. The British Isles had their goblins, knackers, and leprechauns. Germany its Erdelut and stillevolk, and Scandinavia its trolls and bergfolk, and huldrafolk. But their kinship to the earth and their matchless skills and their stunted stature were universal. They shared another trait too, one suggested by the German term stillevolk, or quiet people. They were a reclusive race. Although dwarves were intimately twined in the lives of the country folk of some lands, the interactions were a matter of secret cooperation or furtive mischief. Humans and dwarves rarely met face to face. Even in the Faeroes, hostile, treeless, and swept by the Arctic winds, peopled only by a few settlers who eked out a living by raising sheep, gathering seabirds' eggs, and fishing the gray Atlantic swell, dwarves still kept clear of their mortal neighbors. As befitted a people so closely allied to the earth, their presence was most often evident on the face of a landscape, or in the breath of the wind. A patch of unusual lushness on a grassy hillside might indicate the underground fires of a dwarf's forge or oven, warming the soil above it and quickening vegetative growth. Within the earth itself, a tapping sound that came from a region untunneled by mortal miners might betray the activity of a mining party of dwarves. And in Scandinavia, echoes cast back from stony mountainsides were known in the Norse language as dvergambol, voice of the dwarf. Dwarves, perhaps amusing themselves, were said to cause the echo by mimicking any sound heard in their domain. But they melted into the rocks long before a human intruder could grow near enough to spot them. If you're enjoying my content, please help me grow by liking, sharing, subscribing, or adding a little comment, just a tiny heart, or anything you feel like saying. Thank you so much. Have a happy rest of your day.